Welcome to week 10 of our Go Deeper into the Gospels Bible study. We've been meeting for the past 10 weeks, I guess. Tonight is the 10th week of meeting here on Wednesday nights. We have several people from our church family joining us on Zoom, but I've been putting these videos out on YouTube so that you can all enjoy what we're studying and what we're going through, sort of get a summary version of our hour-long study. And tonight we're going to sort of be wrapping up the first sort of semester of this Bible study. We are going to take a break for the summer. Again, I've mentioned this before, but my wife and I are expecting our second child, our second son, at the end of July. And there's lots, obviously, that we could be doing in the meantime, and we will probably have some kind of small group or Bible study to continue. It just won't be led by me. So I don't know how much it will appear here on YouTube, but you can certainly visit our website, gladtidingschurchofgod.com, to find out about how perhaps you can join us on Zoom. And you can also visit my website, messianicniagara.com, for more teaching and more resources from me and things I've done in the past, and our current podcast that we do here or there with my nephew Noah called Variologies. You can catch that. We're also going to be taking a hiatus for that, but all of these things, in this Bible study and some of the other things that we're doing, will resume at some point in the fall. And of course, you're more than welcome to, again, visit gladtidingschurchofgod.com or messianicniagara.com and maybe revisit things or discover things that you haven't yet consumed that we've put out there. But nevertheless, tonight we are continuing to study in the book of John chapter 4, verses 1 to 42 primarily. And I'll be honest, this is just a very, very much an overview study. We're not looking at things in detail. This is an important story, the time when Jesus and his disciples went to Samaria, and Jesus had an interaction with a woman at a well, and he revealed his messiahship there to her, and it sort of spread from there. And it's an important story, but it's not necessarily something that we have to, at this moment, dig deep into. So we're just going to take a look at it and sort of look at it from an overview perspective. And this is in the chronology, as far as I understand. And please, anyone in the comments or email me if I'm incorrect about this. But I believe these 2 or 3 chapters here in the book of John chapter 2, at the end of John 1 to here at the end of John 4, we're actually finding, and John, the gospel writer, is presenting us stories and teachings, if you will, that do not appear in the synoptic gospels, and in fact occur prior to where the synoptic gospels continue after the temptation of Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 4, for example, and you can find the parallels in Luke and Mark, Jesus is tempted in the wilderness by the devil, and then after that he's sort of in Capernaum and in Galilee, and he is doing his ministry that we're all familiar with. But John doesn't talk about, I don't believe he even mentions the temptation by the devil. Instead, he covers what Jesus was doing post being baptized by Jesus, so after being baptized by John rather, but before he starts his ministry out of Capernaum and the area of Galilee, and from time to time going to Jerusalem and Judea. But the point is that this is interesting material that we're not getting in the other three gospels. So this story itself is interesting. Jesus and the disciples, they stop in Samaria, and the disciples go off to find some food, and Jesus initiates a conversation with a woman at a well. And just right off the bat, this seems to be a model for us in terms of engaging with people regarding talking to them about God, talking to them about Jesus, talking to them about faith and meaning and purpose, all the wonderful things that are important to us as a part of our faith journey. Sometimes we have to initiate conversations with people. So Jesus, in fact, asks her for something to drink, some water to drink. Now, we're told in the text that Jews and Samaritans don't normally associate with one another. So that right there is something that we could perhaps at another time go into detail about why there was this conflict between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people, what their shared heritage was, and where what they differed on, and why there was such a conflict. But the point is this, is that despite this conflict and despite the, what would you say, perhaps the sense of, otherness that the Samaritans had, this story is going to show that the beginnings of the overall gospel story, which is that the salvation that comes through Jesus, that God granted to his people Israel, is something that is available to the whole world. And he's going to start with the first, who are the people that are most connected to Israel and yet are still other? And that's the Samaritans. And so, again, like I said, Jesus initiates the conversation with the woman, asking her for a drink of water, and he eventually turns the conversation into a spiritual discussion, saying that, in fact, he could offer her living water. And he said that whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. So Jesus was able to reveal that he, and this is how he went about his conversation, and how he was sort of being able to, what would you say, that he was trying to entice her to be curious about what he had to say. So he said that he knew something about her life, right? That she had already been married 5 times, and that she was currently living with someone who wasn't her husband. So imagine somebody coming up to you and saying something like very personal in that sense. It probably may have been public knowledge, but they had never met before, as far as we know, and she certainly didn't know Jesus. So quite the encounter, right? So Jesus encounters, or has an encounter with this woman, or I should say the woman encounters Jesus, perhaps is a better way of saying that. And then the woman recognizes Jesus over time, right? The woman no doubt was in shock. She begins to recognize Jesus. At the very first, she said, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." So she immediately knows that something's going on. There's something different about this guy. He seems to be connected to God because he knows something about my past and something about my present, right? And so she brings up the fact, and this is so interesting. She says, "Sir, I can perceive that you are a prophet." But then she brings up the conflict between her people, the Samaritans, and the Jewish people. And she brings up this difference, and this is one difference we can say, that they say that God should be worshipped there, in their capital, whereas the Jewish people obviously say that God should be worshipped in Jerusalem. That's where the temple was. That's where God's placed his name, and that's why the tabernacle and then the temple, both the first and second temples were there in Jerusalem, because that's where God established where he was to be worshipped in that official way. And Jesus said that, in fact, there is a way to know how to resolve the conflict, right? He said, "You worship what you do not know, but we," and who is he talking about? He's talking about this conflict between the Samaritans and the Jewish people. We, the Jews, he's counting himself as a part of the Jewish people, the people of Israel, of course. And he said, "We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews. Salvation is from the Jewish people." Or comes through the Jewish people is maybe perhaps a clearer way of saying that. The Jewish people are not ignorant of God and the proper way to worship him. Now, obviously, we can't go into exactly what that means, but that's important as we continue our study of the Gospels. But get this: Jesus said that in fact, it's more important how you worship God, or in the manner in which the attitude that you take to worship God, than it is where you worship God. Because it's interesting. On the one hand, this is very much my view of Jesus and the apostles in terms of their relationship with Judaism. On the one hand, they affirm the truths and the sort of tenets of Judaism. On the other hand, they aren't afraid to say, that's true, and without negating that, here's something else that's true that perhaps is maybe more important or of greater significance. So Jesus affirms the long-standing Jewish biblical idea that God is to be worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem, and that's the only authorized location for at least sacrificial worship to be given to God. But then he says, actually, you don't have to worship in Jerusalem or in Samaria. You can worship anywhere because, as he says, that what's more important than where you worship God is that you worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers, right? True worshipers of God are those who love him with all of their hearts, who seek after truth, both the truth about God and also in terms of the truth about ourselves, coming to God honestly and transparently and being humble. And so the woman said, as a response to this, interestingly enough, she says, I know that the Messiah is coming, and he will declare all things to us. And amazingly, Jesus responded to her and said, I who speak to you am he. This is perhaps the most clear declaration by Jesus himself that he was the Messiah. And so Jesus revealed to her that he was the Messiah, and in a moment we're going to see that she recognized him as such. But there's another point here as an aside. This is just more of when you're reading and studying the Bible, you can absorb the theology that's within the text. And this isn't even John's point at all. But it's something that we can absorb and sort of point out, because in my opinion, and I think it's reasonable to assume this when you look at the Bible as a whole, and when you look at the synoptic gospels, and then when you look at John in light of that, and you look at key verses like John 17:3 and other places, that to the Apostle John, who wrote the gospel, God is one individual person. He is the Father, right? Because here in John chapter 4, Jesus equates God with the Father, right? Because he says that we must worship the Father in spirit and in truth. But he's referring to God, right? So God, in the mind of Jesus and in the mind of the Apostle John writing this gospel, and I would say to all of the early disciples of Jesus, God was the Father. And Jesus is not God because he is the Son of God. And to be Son of God is not a downgrade. That's an incredible thing. That means you are the Messiah. You are the most elevated human being that exists. God has raised Jesus from the dead and raised him to his right hand, right? And so that's not anything that is to be ashamed of. That God is one person, he is the Father, that he is Spirit, and that we can refer to him as the Holy Spirit. That is God. And then there's a second person, and that's Jesus, who is the Son of God. And that's an important distinction to make. Jesus assumes it. The Apostle John assumes it, doesn't take the time to say it. Although in John 17:3, he comes pretty close to sort of giving us a clarifying statement when Jesus said, John said by having Jesus say this, that this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, meaning the Father. And there's one person who is the only true God, and Jesus the Messiah, the one that the only true God sent. That's Unitarian theology, and that what I believe is apostolic Christology and theology. Okay, so we have the woman encountering Jesus, we have the woman recognizing Jesus, and now we're going to see that the woman is following after Jesus. Because the woman who had been living an unrepentant, sinful life up to this point has now received a fresh start, right? In a way, this is her born-again experience. She's been born again from above, as we explored last study. Although that's not explicitly taught here, but it's to be assumed because something has occurred inside of her to get her excited and to move her towards, as we're going to see, to evangelize for Jesus. So there's got to be some sort of internal change, right? Whether or not that continued on and whether or not she pursued Jesus and pursued God in a true way after that, we don't know because the text doesn't say. But as a story that presents us with her encountering Jesus, her recognizing who he is, and then now following him, I think it's safe to assume that she had this spiritual experience. She excitedly went into the city to tell others about Jesus, and then she led others to him. Like, that's the wonderful experience of a disciple of Jesus. Her desire was to hear more from him, right? That's what it means to be a disciple. I've heard Jesus and I want to hear more. I want to learn more. Her desire was for Jesus, because Jesus is this wonderful medium that brings us to God. He's the person who stands in the gap between us and God, and he shows us what God is like, and we want to worship God through him, because finally we are given an understanding of God through him. And so she leads people to him. Her desire is now for Jesus, and it's not unreasonable to assume that her life then changed, that she was on a new path. We don't know for sure, but it's reasonable to assume that. And then lastly, she evangelizes for Jesus. As I just mentioned, she began to evangelize, and as a result of her evangelism for Jesus, she led people to Jesus, and she said this, John reports this, from that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman. So because of the testimony that this woman shared of her experience with Jesus and the story that we're reading here, many among the Samaritans believed in Jesus, and we assume became disciples in that sense. And after hearing Jesus, we're told that it is no longer, I see. So, okay, at 17 minutes, we're going to make another cut. And after hearing Jesus for themselves, these people that the woman led to Jesus, they said, it is no longer because of what you said to the woman. It's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard ourselves and know that this is the one. This is indeed the Savior of the world, the Messiah. Boy, that's a wonderful, example for us. We encounter Jesus. We're going through life, and suddenly we have a reason to want to look to God, and we do so through the person of Jesus. And we have an encounter with him. It opens our eyes, maybe is a good way to put it. Where our eyes opened to who Jesus is and how he can bring us to God. And then we experience Jesus, right? We recognize him for who he is, and we really have a grasp of the power that comes in his name and what he's done. And then we begin to follow Jesus, right? Our life starts to change and reflect what Jesus stood for and what he taught and what he modeled for us, and we begin to follow Jesus every day in our lives, and we grow in that. And then lastly, we evangelize for Jesus, and we bring other people to him. And people might come, let's say, to our church or to our small group studies or out to coffee with us, or however we evangelize, right? And they might come because they're our friends, or because we ask them nicely, or because we're enticing them with some food or some presentation. These are all fine things, but it has to be something that they then encounter themselves. They encounter Jesus themselves that will put them on that path, the same pattern that we just talked about, that we've gone through and that we want them to experience. They will then experience that pattern of recognizing Jesus, encountering him, recognizing him, following him, and then hopefully they will evangelize for him as well. And so that will transform our lives, that will transform our communities. If we want an answer to all the troubles that we're currently facing in our world and in North America here, Jesus is the answer. I know that sounds cliched, but Jesus is the answer, because it's in him that we have purpose, that we have morality, that we have a sense of community and peace and unity. There's no racial divisions, so to speak, in the faith, in the Christian faith, because even though the Bible clearly makes a distinction between Jews and Gentiles and different people groups throughout the world, we can't erase those distinctions, but in Jesus, they don't matter. In other words, they're not a barrier. We embrace all people, right? We don't discriminate against anyone. The gospel message is inclusive, and that's a wonderful thing. All right. Well, there you go. That's the up to verse 42 of John chapter 4. And then in verses 43 to 54, obviously we don't have the time to go through it all in this study, but this is actually the point at which we're going to resume our study in the fall. We're going to, because what it says here in this passage, and there's actually a parallel to this in Matthew chapter 4, verse 12, Mark chapter 1, verse 14, and Luke chapter 4, verses 14 to 15, Jesus finally arrives in Galilee, and in particular, Capernaum. So actually, let's see what it says here in verse 43 of John chapter 4. After the 2 days, he went forth from there into Galilee. So he went from Samaria into Galilee. And for Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things that he did in Jerusalem at the feast. For they themselves also went to the feast. And we're told about how he came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water into wine. And there was a royal official whose son was sick at Capernaum. And it goes on, and we're told about a healing that Jesus performs. And the very last verse says, this is again a second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. And so again, this sort of launches Jesus's ministry that we read about in the Synoptic Gospels, and that's where we're going to resume our study this fall when Jesus makes an appearance in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth, and when Jesus begins declaring the gospel message in Capernaum and the rest of Galilee, and from there on we'll continue on in the Gospels, and soon enough we'll get to the Sermon on the Mount and the wonderful things that Jesus taught in those chapters. But that's where we're going to end it, because again, this is a great point. We're 10 weeks in, and we're going to take a break for the rest of the summer as it relates to this Gospels Bible study, but we're going to resume at some point in the fall. You can follow us at gladtidingschurchofgod.com and join us on Facebook, facebook.com/gladtidingschurchofgod. And of course, our YouTube channel is youtube.com/gladtidingschurchofgod. And then I have my own personal website, messianicniagara.com, which I created many years ago and have maintained. And if you haven't been there lately, visit it. You'll see that it's been updated and redesigned. You can watch my podcast with my nephew, Noah, and it's called Evangelize, and that is at my website, messianicniagara.com. And I have this Messianic Niagara YouTube channel. And so if you haven't subscribed, hit subscribe and watch the videos and hit like and share them with others. I would love to see this channel grow, and to see, and especially if you're in the area here in the Niagara region, to connect with us and come be a part of our church, Glad Tidings Church of God. Again, we're currently meeting online because of the current situation, but you can join us in several ways, in various ways there. And finally, I'm very privileged to make my living being a pastor for the Glad Tidings Church of God, and it's a wonderful blessing. But however, there are expenses that go along with Messianic Niagara and with various different things that we're doing, the equipment that we need to do the podcast, and the hosting costs that go along with it. So you are more than welcome, no obligation, but you are more than welcome. We'd really appreciate it if you could support us both at gladtidingschurchofgod.com/support, also at messianicniagara.com, and you can click on the donate link there. Either way, I would definitely appreciate your support. A little donation goes a long way. It certainly helps us continue to sustain what we're doing as a ministry, both as a church and as my own personal Bible teaching. So thank you so much. We'll see you again in the fall as it relates to this Gospels Bible study, and hope to see you online over the summer. Take care. God bless.